shared flat with Arthur Lindsay.
Arthur Lindsay and Mark Cunningham.
So that must have been an intense household.
It was home.
And a bit later on, perhaps the beginning of the end in a sense, was this area was infested with with dozens and dozens of art galleries and the sort of downtown art explosion, paving the way for the current East Village. And I just wanted to ask both Connie and James if they would give us a sort of a sense of what it was like, how different it was to live in the LAS back in those days.
All right, well, when I first came to New York, it was at the very end of '75, actually, last week of 1975, and I was staying temporarily in an apartment on Sullivan and Bleecker, and the first thing I did was bought a Voice to see what music was happening, and when I first came to New York, I was really, my big ambition was to be a jazz musician. So I saw that Lester Bowie and his brother Joe Bowie, the great trumpeter, were playing at a place called La Mama Theater on 3rd and Avenue C, so I just started walking down Bleecker and then down 3rd Street, and I started noticing that there were all these abandoned buildings completely blown out, and then there were empty lots covered with rubble, bricks, and just got the whole lot just like a bomb site. And
that was because the people who owned the buildings would actually pay people to burn down their own buildings to sort of get insurance money, wouldn't they? Because they couldn't rent out enough apartments.
Yeah, more or less, I guess so.
And Connie, what was it like when you moved into this neighborhood?
Virtually unrecognizable as to how it is today.
And whether was there any sort of sense of amenities or
No, there weren't any commercial properties on Avenue B whatsoever, besides maybe a few bodegas, and Avenue A maybe one Polish restaurant in addition to the grocery stores, and then First Avenue, you might have had a pharmacy or a liquor store, but they were completely encased in bulletproof glass. So you had to, slide your money through the glass, and they'd give you your prescription or your, liquor or whatever. And Second Avenue, you could buy a newspaper. And then between 2nd and 3rd, also 2nd Avenue had the Fillmore East, and 5 Spot was on 2nd and 3rd, and it was really an interesting concept because, of course, New York is one of the oldest, most established cities in the United States, but over here it was a frontier.
Right.
And it was very physically dangerous, and
I think you told me when I interviewed you, you said that you would look down into Tompkins Square Park, and most mornings you'd see a body there or something.
Yeah, Simon, I must say that I exaggerated to make it. I realized that made copy, but
Actually, my experience on the Lower East Side, I never really had any problems in this neighborhood. I did get robbed several times, but it was never in this neighborhood. The only bad experience. One time I was walking down 2nd Avenue and I had $1 sticking out of my shirt pocket, and some guy tried to grab it right out of my pocket. But my first apartment was right around the corner from here, second between A and B, and it was a 5-flight walk up, and the walls had red walls and a black ceiling, and the windows were totally covered with some kind of boards and things. I think it had been some kind of drug place before I moved in. And the thing that was the biggest difference, though, was how I got to the apartment. I just walked, right around the corner was the office of the building management or owner or whatever. All I did was go in there, give her, 1 month's rent, $110, and 1 month's deposit, and that was it. There were no forms, no background checks. They were glad to have anybody that would take, those places.
And wasn't Lydia Lunch was your roommate as well?
Yeah. After I'd been there a few months, one night she knocked on my door and ended up staying for about a year, and then after that we got a storefront on 4th and A.
Well, when I was growing up, there was a tremendous sort of glamour to New York and the music scene, and one thing that struck me was that there was a kind of mutual thing as well, because it seemed like the UK and New York were very in sync musically. There were certain parallels between what was going on. A band like the Pop Group had quite a bit in common with the Contortions. There was a band in Stephen's neck of the wood in Scotland called the Fire Engines, who I just interviewed him, and he's the singer, and he said they had no New York on the turntable constantly, and they even did a song called "Insert Yourself" as a kind of tribute to
really?
Contort Yourself. And but I wanted to ask Stephen about this, because you were like someone who the whole of Orange Juice were really kind of really taken with the glamour of New York and the sort of the first wave of bands from CBGBs.
Oh yeah.
And didn't you once have when you put an ad in some local fanzine, you put something like a New York band forming in Glasgow?
Something like that, yeah. Embarrassing. But yeah, we thought that those, that single Polish restaurant on Avenue A, or First Avenue, was probably the most glamorous place in the world. So, what do we know? But I guess the formative thing, the formative image of New York as it's coming into being, I guess, long-term incarnation, decades-long incarnation from punk rock onwards, musically anyway, coming together, was there was an article in the NME in '75, and I think they actually did a follow-up about CBGBs, and suddenly there was all these possibilities out there, because until then, there were scattered individual geniuses working here or there who would make an album for 3 years, and you had no access to them, no idea what they were thinking, and suddenly you had television, Talking Heads, Blondie, the Ramones, etc., 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 and you couldn't hear them yet. I mean, that's probably the great thing, because it seemed so magical the way that they were described, that and New York became this locus of the imagination. And strangely enough, in Glasgow there was one, I always say my life went downhill from there, because there was one weekend in May of 1977 where on the Saturday night at a university where we had to bluff our way in, because we weren't, I guess we were only 15 or 16, and you had to have student credentials. We pretended to be with a magazine or some bullshit. It was the Ramones supported by the Talking Heads, which is quite a dog bill. The next night it was Blondie supported by television. So after that, everything else is a disappointment.
So, James, could you tell me a bit about tell us about the loft jazz scene, because I think that was kind of something that you gravitated towards, and then you quickly kind of felt you didn't fit in, right?
Yeah, well, it was basically what it was what you would call free jazz or avant-garde jazz. A lot of the musicians were from Chicago or St. Louis, and they basically played in lofts, mostly in Soho, and some in Chelsea, a few in this neighborhood. In fact, two of the main venues were like a block from CBGB's, the Tin Palace and Studio Rivney. But there was no overlap between, the CBGB's was totally rock and roll, and they totally looked down on jazz. And, I was probably the only person that hung out on both scenes, but.
Was the loft jazz scene, were they more in a kind of spiritual late 60s?
Well, yeah, they were kind of, especially the audience, it was almost a completely white audience, and they were kind of stuck in the hippie era, they would all sit on the floor with their legs crossed, and I just couldn't stand the audience, you know. Like, I liked the music fine, but and also, you know, I just didn't fit in. My whole sense of style and everything, even was more, you know, informed by rock and roll. And after a while, you know, I had a little band that played at these places, but you know, I could see that it just wasn't going to happen. That I just did not fit into the scene, you know, and so I gravitated more and more toward like hanging out at CBGBs and Max's, and after a while I decided that, you know, that I wanted to put something together that would appeal to that audience, you know, and still would have all the kind of music that I liked in it. Plus I always kind of had a secret fantasy of being a rock and roll star anyway, so.
Well, Vivien, you were involved in something that was sort of similar but quite different in another way, a whole kind of improvisational scene in London based around the London's Musician Collective, and there was a kind of interface between post-punk and these sort of English improvisers, but it was quite different from, I think, from what James was involved in, much more whimsical, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, whimsical is a good word for it. But it's funny because when James was talking just now, I realised England has traditionally been a bit more eclectic, hasn't it? Maybe it's being part of Europe and having so much music as part of your family. But certainly, as you say in your book, Simon, you know, there was no boundaries. And when I look back on those times, like at the Musicians Collective and that famous afternoon when we recorded 2 albums in one afternoon with a band of 49 Americans, it was just so free. I wonder where you get that complete sense of freedom now. It's like all the musics of the world were your grab bag. You know, maybe some people would say that's a slightly colonial mentality, and that's something one could argue. But it made for a very rich brew. You know, bringing in the reggae, bringing in the jazz. It used to be enormous fun doing that sort of jazz where you used to throw things inside the piano and do treated piano, and working with Steve Beresford. He was always great with the toy instruments. Who uses toy instruments now? Bring back the toys.
New York back then was not like that, you know. It wasn't. There were definite boundaries, you know. Rock and rollers stuck to rock and roll, and jazz musicians stuck to jazz. I mean, I had jazz musicians refuse to play jazz with me because they knew that I was in a band called Teenage Jesus and the Jerks, you know. They just couldn't deal with it.
On religious grounds.
Ideological grounds. And also, you know, there was a tremendous racial tension in New York at that time, you know, between black and white. I mean, black and white people just did not communicate, you know, except in terms of hostility, you know.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that in a way, because one of the sort of backdrops to the whole of music that I write about in Rip It Up and Start Again is really all the amazing black music that was going on in that time. And from well, really it begins with things like what James Brown was doing, and then Parliament Funkadelic, and in a different way what the Chic organisation were doing, with all their various things. And one difference between Britain and America at that time, as much as there was this great, sort of felt like an alliance or an affinity or something, was I don't get the sense that reggae was such a big thing in New York, whereas in Britain, especially in London, it really was like, it was like a huge thing, wasn't it?
No, it wasn't that big.
Yeah, I have to tell you, I have to tell everyone. I was at a Bob Marley and the Wailers concert at Max's Kansas City in 1976. They were an opening band, and they, we went as fans, and they were almost booed off the stage. Yeah, and the audience, which was white, was saying, Jamaica Queens, man, you know. I mean, it was so, we were petrified, like, you idiots, but yeah.
See, here they never had that shebeen culture. That was one of the things that really enriched.
Can you explain?
Well, here I remember in the early 80s going to a lot of after-hours joints that were really hopping. I don't know whether it exists in that form now. But in England we had the shebeens, which is because the West Indian community, when they arrived, they wanted to rave and there was nowhere to go and do it. So people just seized their partying and would just take abandoned properties or squats or open up places. It was the forerunner of rave and the warehouse, rave and warehouse parties. And so you could go and be rocking all night for a quid at the door, 50 pence at the door, all the baby sham you can drink, and plenty of other light amusements and refreshments as well. Of course, it was completely illegal. I remember when one of them closed down, the DJ turned up to open up the club like he'd been doing for many years, only to find that the floor had been chopped up with an axe. That was the only way they could stop the party happening. There was no floor. Yeah.
Well, in Britain, if you didn't have access to that kind of fun, if you're living in the provinces, and believe me, Glasgow was a world lit only by fire, you still had access to black culture. I don't want to sort of lord it over Americans here because I'm going for my green card interview next week. But even on the radio, there's a type of music called Northern Soul, which is a weird cargo cult. I mean, it really is. It's these obscure sort of post Motown records, very much in the model of Motown. Even after Motown had moved on to bigger productions and all kinds of things, they still were cranking out these small records on regional American labels. And in Britain, they could be top 10 hits. Reggae records could be top 10 hits. I did a piece recently about the Sugar Hill label, and the woman who ran it, Sylvia Robinson, before that had a label called All Platinum, and she'd had a big hit here as a solo act.
Pillow Talk.
Pillow Talk.
She also had several other hits too.
Mickey and Sylvia,
So
right?
she just went under. She put that out herself. She was middle-aged, she had kids. She put it out herself because Al Green wouldn't record it. Had a huge hit here and over there. But subsequently, All Platinum, they were kind of churning out. It's kind of a shabby label, a little bit novelty inclined, and most of the records were hits in Britain. Here, there'd have been regional hits at best. But somehow, there's just, I guess it comes down to the radio. It's the vagaries of radio. In America, there's more radio stations, so they chop it up more finely. Whereas in Britain, at the time, it was just an insanely eclectic place. Not through any idealism, just coincidence.
I think there's a sort of there is a kind of British thing of projecting towards Black American music, and I don't know. It's almost like an escape from the drudgery, dreariness of England, and also the emotional repression of being
Escape from Cliff Richards.
But there are these sort of tremendous cults of very specific Black American musics. And they all have their adherents, and they all have their kind of custodians who amass all this kind of knowledge about them. And it's the same with reggae, obviously, and jazz. And but going back to the black music thing, I thought it was interesting that obviously for James Brown was like a big figure, and you kind of picked up on this kind of paroxysmic frenzy. Controlled frenzy of the James Brown sound, whereas for Orange Juice, the big band was Chic, wasn't it? Which is much more like elegant, this sort of zingy sound. It's kind of it was a different fantasy of blackness, wasn't it? I was wondering if you could talk about the impact of Chic.
Yeah, it's hard to, I guess there was a strange connection happened between, I mean, I hate to talk about actual music, but when you come down to the nuts and bolts of it. But between Lou Reed's rhythm guitar and Nile Rodgers' rhythm guitar, and we happen to have a guy in the band who was a pretty good songwriter who happened to be able to play that shit, which kind of could hold things together. We just thought, I guess one of the themes in your book that keeps coming back again and again is the idea of modernism. At the time, you were geared after punk rock. If you had any clue at all, punk was pretty much finished by the end of '77. I was just talking to Vivien when Sid Vicious joined the band. It was kind of too bad. Sorry, that was really a signal that put away that shit. Who knew that the fucking Strokes would be here in 2006? One of the things that was imprinted on you if you were growing up at a certain time was this idea of modernism. I mean, we wouldn't have called it that. You didn't even blink an eye or think about it. But there was a point after punk where suddenly, I think as Vivien said earlier, something about the toy box being open. Suddenly, after years of older professional musicians doing things at their speed, and the media being at a distance. Suddenly things were less mediated and faster paced, and a whole, I guess punk was a kind of year zero. So you started again, a whole influx of people who'd never been in bands before and didn't do it the old way, and so everyone was grabbing, and there was a lot of great stuff made and a lot of total shite made. But you know, that was what it was. And something like Chic sounded to us like the future, and that's what you wanted to be part of. So I guess that's it.
Connie, when we were speaking in the blue room or the green room, I can't remember what it's called, but you happened to mention that one thing that came back to you when you were thinking about this period was that how incredibly hard you and all the other no-wave bands worked, and it was like it sort of relates to what Stephen was saying about this sort of commitment to modernism, this sort of strenuous desire to do something new. I mean, was that? And I think in what someone in Mars, maybe it was Mark, described the band as being on a kind of countdown from 10 to 0. And when they reached 0, they'd eliminated tonality, unified rhythm, basically all things that make music.
But
But I mean, that seems to, you know, and that all happened within the space of like a couple of years, right? I mean, what was sort of was that sort of how you felt in Mars, that you just wanted to push it as far as you could go?
I don't know really, Simon, if it was an overarching construct, but it was the truth. You know, it happened that way. And why I mentioned it to you was because after reading the chapter and hearing about, you know, James, you know, rehearsing so much, and Lydia rehearsing so much, and DNA rehearsing so much, which I well knew, you know, because I knew them, and we rehearsed so much, was the, you know, intense commitment and discipline that we all had. I mean, it could be viewed as you know, a totally self-indulgent era, but it was actually a very strict era in a sense, you know, totally committed, as you said, you know, to...
And it wasn't oriented toward any kind of success or stardom either, you know? None of us, I don't think any of us ever had any idea that there were any commercial possibilities at all for what we were doing, you know, when we first started.
But didn't you did a disco album, right?
Yeah, but that was later, you know. That was,
That's when you'd exhausted modernism and earning no money, you'd exhausted it. Right?
I mean, it was, for me, it was just, well, for one thing, it was just, you know, I'd already been rejected by the jazz scene, and then the rock scene, you know, CBGB's with the earlier band, it was kind of like high school or something, you know? Like, if you weren't in a band, you were nobody. You know, they wouldn't even talk to you. And so I just had a great desire to just show these people, you know? Yeah, and that's a tremendous motivation.
I think there's a contrast. It's funny hearing you guys talking about, you know, rehearsing all the time, truly, and like empty buildings. I mean, you know, unused apartment buildings and all this kind of stuff, apartment blocks. Because I think in Britain, well, first of all, there wasn't so much free real estate because it's a smaller, cramped country. But also,
but you had all those squats, though.
Yeah, no, there are for, yeah, in London particularly.
Yes, there were squats.
Once
and
again,
of course there was the Dole.
The Dole, the Dole, which is basically, you know, we built this city on
Rock and Dole.
Yeah. No, I mean the Dole basically. When you think about what happened after Postpunk, which you know I think was for me not a great time, but when you think about things like George Michael and Wham and Duran Duran and Culture Club, they basically
Do you mean
built.
you don't like them?
Not so much. They built their careers on years of unemployment. I mean, as did I. And the government sort of went soft on that. It's funny to try to explain it now, but they did. And they just kind of let you off the leash, and you could kind of get away with it. And that was basically a giant Arts Council grant. Yeah. And in fact, probably if the government had analysed it dollar for dollar, they would have thought they were doing a good job, because all those millions came back when they conquered MTV.
Well, that's why Tony Blair did that thing when he came in of calling in the musicians to Downing Street. I don't know whether when he was doing this thing called Britannia.
Yeah, Oasis coming to Downing
Yes, Oasis and people coming, because they realised that it was a marketable thing that they'd accidentally let flourish by not knowing what to do with these sort of trash.
And he also, Tony Blair upheld the example of Alan McGee as this independent label guy with Creation going from £1,000 borrowed off his father to a multi-million-dollar sort of thing as the essence of the new Labour Party was about.
Get on your bike.
But
So here the the New York City government is so reactionary. I mean, they've got a great resource that they could exploit, with clubs, the whole music scene and the whole club scene. But instead, they do everything to harass it, And they have been for ever since Giuliani took over.
The thing that comes back to a theme that's kind of inherent in Simon's book is that while you guys were rehearsing your bottoms off, 12 hours a day, whatever.
I never rehearsed that much.
Sounds good.
I mean, if you want to put it glibly, which I guess I usually do, in Britain you'd be rehearsing your interview for a manifesto, because the engine of the great engine of post-punk, of punk rock and post-punk and things subsequently has been the press, because Britain is such, again it comes back to geography is destiny.
Yeah, and you got so many music papers that have to fill up their paper every week with all this.
But not only that,
It's a hothouse atmosphere. It's and things travel very quickly. Ideas, especially at the time, as I said, every month or two there was a paradigm shift. It was, our dear friend John Savage, probably before punk breathed its last, was touting new music with a K. Which was things like, it was deriving from things like Noy and
I remember
Kraftwerk.
that issue.
Right.
It was Kraftwerk, that
But it was
issue of
also
sound in the
coming
magazine.
to
Throbbing Gristle.
post-punk bands like the Susan Banshees and Subway Set, Cabaret Voltaire, whatever. So these were, it's like you can feel this sense of disappointment when it's all over. But you think, oh yeah, this is what life is like. Every 2 months there'll be some exciting new development.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's one thing I wanted to talk about was how there was, we have two people who were both journalists and musicians, and there was, yes, and there was this kind of, a lot of people in the bands in the punk and post-punk era were kind of like non-musicians, but they had like really good ideas. Almost like a critical head. And then you had critics who were kind of like crusading for various things, and it was almost like the roles were reversible, and both critics and musicians kind of contributed to a sort of climate of ideas. Because you were very close to Pill, right? Weren't you?
Yeah, I was very, and the Slits. I used to jam on stage with the Slits sometimes at Glastonbury. But in a way, that's the way it should be. It's ludicrous the way it is now. When artists are separated from the press by these like ludicrous PR people, and they think they're all that, but they're just another. We used to think of ourselves more as cultural workers in a sense. Does that ring a bell with you?
Vaguely, yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
That's quite Maoist.
Maybe that's because I was very involved with rough trade, in the early days of rough trade and so on. But when you think about it, as human entities, a lot of us have these overlapping skills. And it's just which way you choose to utilise them. And in that climate, it was not, prohibitive to utilise more than one of your skills.
Well, talking of, we weren't really talking of Pill, but to bring it up anyway. I was really struck when I was researching the book just how highly respected public image were on both sides of the Atlantic. How they topped. They were very close to the top of the critics' poll in the Village Voice, with second edition as it was called. And there's a great story about Lester Bangs when his house caught fire, or his apartment block caught fire. He didn't grab, a scrapbook of all his writing or his work in progress or a photo album. It was metal boxes dragged into the street.
Keith Levine played with me one time.
Really?
Yeah, because one time it was right after Anya died, and I had a show in a big show in London. I can't remember the club. It was a big, huge place. And I had this black band at the time, all young black kids from like the Bronx and Brooklyn, and they just didn't show up at the airport. They just didn't believe that this was going to happen. I don't know. And I had the bass player and the background singer, and I had to put together a show in London in like 2 days, and.
And Keith Levine.
Actually, I was staying with some friends of mine in a squat, and Keith Levine shows up, and he had just escaped from a rehab place, literally gone over the wall. So he did the show with me.
He was a
savage. savaged by the English critics.
Anything for shilling, those people.
Keith Lorraine, I think, it goes against the grain probably of what was happening in Britain, because as Simon says in the book, he was a guy who actually had the prog rock albums hidden away. His favourite guitarist was Steve Howe, and he'd done something that really sunk in with me, refers back to you, what you were saying, is he'd done what you didn't do, which was practice, practice, practice. I don't know how you pulled off your gig, James, but he was pretty well regarded.
But actually in Simon's book, I couldn't help but note something I told you, which was when I was with Pill at the Manor when they were recording that album, and they were talking about, it was in fact none other than Keith who was saying, I've got to do, they almost say, the engineers were going nuts because they wouldn't go in the studio and work, obviously, let me do my little single laundrette. They didn't want to work, and why they didn't want to work was because they were so obsessed with finding this new sound, whereas, everything builds on everything else,
and that's
there's
Flowers of
nothing new,
Romance
but
we're
they didn't
talking
know
about.
that.
Because
You know the one I mean.
Yeah, I think it's Flowers of Romance, and Stephen, you were saying that
It's
when we
admirable.
were talking that you felt that Pill in a way represented, it's fantastic record metal box, but then where do you go next? It's like like almost like there had to be a change, and in New York, the music got more danceable again. It got more kind of hedonism oriented. And the same kind of thing happened with the kind of mutant disco sound, and then Kid Creole and people like that. And then in Britain, Orange Juice kind of led the way with the Human League to this sort of more fun, the return of the love song, all this kind of stuff. So it was kind of like we've taken modernism as far as it can go.
Yeah. Well, there was a point where something like when Public Image came out with the first single, it was just sensational. It just the world turned upside down. It's like, how are you going to follow up the Sex Pistols? The whole world is waiting, and he blows everyone away, just like that. And then Metal Box comes out, which also blew everyone away. Although being a double album, it was stretching a little thin. But if you're not a musician, which Lydon wasn't, conceptualist, you're going to run up against a glass ceiling at some point. And that started to happen to a lot of people. There was a lot of great debut albums, ...
Well, I think that's basically the case in rock and roll, almost in its whole history. I mean, there's not that many bands that have, they always have great first album, maybe the second album is good, pretty good, and then they kind of, it's downhill from there.
Connie, what did the Mars were like? Kind of all the no wave bands, probably the most rigorous, the most audience punishing in some ways. And what did you feel like? Because then the scene kind of changed with bands like the B-52s come along, and it did go all kind of dance oriented and much more, I guess, fun oriented. I mean, did you feel that was a bit betrayal of kind of what you believed in?
Oh, no. I mean, we weren't looking for followers.
Right.
The whole scene kind of exploded, from about middle of '79 all the way through maybe '82, '83. I mean, from just being two clubs, Max and CBGB's, there were clubs everywhere, all over Manhattan, and there was, you could make there was a lot of money being made. Bands were making a lot of money, and there was room for a lot of different kinds of music. Those were like really kind of great years, and then everything changed about '83, '84. It switched over to like big nightclubs like the Palladium, and all of a sudden just no one seemed to care about music anymore.
I mean, how many times a week would you be able to perform?
Not a week, but you could easily play a couple times a month. I mean,
and to big crowds and
yeah,
So maybe we should open it up to questions from the audience. Any questions for our panelists?
Dancing King there now.
What's the next great thing?
there is no next great thing.
That'll cost extra.
In 20 years time, I'll write it down.
Yeah, exactly.
Whatever it was.
What do you think it is?
No, you don't want to hear about it. Oh, sure we do. Go first. Good point.
I think the time for scenes like that are concentrated in one little geographic area has kind of passed. I don't think it's going to be like that anymore in the future.
Well, because everything is sort of organised via the web and
Yeah.
People have, again, quoting dear old Johnny Savage, and people have an excess of access. A friend of mine said that boredom is a great aphrodisiac for the brain. And it really is when you're stuck wherever you were stuck, where I was stuck. When there was not a huge amount of information being exchanged and not a lot of distraction. And as I think, not to reach too high here, but the critic Kenneth Tynan, I can't remember his opposite number, but Kenneth Tynan was sort of a swashbuckling young critic, and he had a conservative older counterpart at the Times and the Observer, and he said that the characteristic sound of an English Sunday morning was his opponent barking up the wrong tree. Anyway, Tynan later made friends with him, and they looked back on the early 60s or late 50s angry young man period of English theatre, and said, he said, well, why can't we get that? Why can't we have that back? That was a time when something was at stake. That was a long-winded way of saying at this time something was at stake, and when everything becomes accessible to everyone, there's not so much at stake anymore.
I think what we need is a general, societal collapse.
Oh, you'll get that already.
Because actually, all of this time we're talking about was a time of that. I mean, New York almost went bankrupt, and it was London and England was in very bad shape.
Yeah.
But I wonder whether it's all going to harken back to sort of maybe like medieval times. You remember before music was recorded and people used to sell it, when within each community there would be people who were good singers, like people going to the pub or in a local wherever, and they would jam together and they would be known in their area. And I think this star system that's arisen through everything being, marketed and having its value like that, maybe it will devolve slightly, because now people can at home have access to do their things and just put out their own contribution the way they would have done before. Now other people can hear it in other countries.
What you're saying, I think, is absolutely correct, and it scares the hell out of me. Because I think there's something to hierarchies, and when that breaks down, you're right. You're absolutely right about the medieval comparison.
Yeah.
That it's small.
But I think it's
people.
nice when people are in touch with their creativity. When everybody has a bash.
Well, we
I
agree
guess
to
I'm a
differ
true
on that.
pop.
I'm showbiz through and through, man.
Never stop.
Why put the emphasis on show business, on the hierarchy versus the sort of day-to-day, the immediate interactive, the generally experience versus the sort of the product thing?
Yeah.
I'm not trying to be difficult about it.
Pardon?
I'm not trying to be difficult about it.
Oh, no, please be difficult. I can handle it. No, it's just taste. It's just a matter of taste. It's a matter of politically, I'm over there, that side. Culturally, to be perfectly honest, I'm a complete fucking fascist. There you go. And I think cultural fascism is good. I think elitism is good, and everything good, that was ever good came from that.
Yeah, creativity is not
rough trade.
creativity is not democratic. Creativity is not democratic. You have to have a vision, and you have to be able to more or less impose it on other people in order to create anything.
But don't worry, I think there's sort of innate I think we were worried there'd be no filtering system, but I think that filtering system is, again, like we were discussing earlier, is innate in humankind, and that even if everybody has a bash, only a few people really will get hurt, so don't worry.
Right. I'm remembering days when I would read sounds and you would tell me what was right. And that song that simplified everything.
How do you define the end of punk and the start of post-punk, the 77?
It's a tricky one. It's kind of messy because there's this awkward fact that I tried to smooth over, which is that some post-punk bands actually started 5 or 6 years before punk.
The punk scene in the English sense was irrelevant to New York, because all the New York bands, they may have been sort of on the conservative side, but they all had their own vision, their own style, completely individual. They had their own look, and that was what was good about it. It was not a coherent movement where all the bands sounded alike.
In fact, I had an argument with a younger American person a few years ago, and it actually got fairly unpleasant, where I was saying, I was saying, talking about New York, punk, Blondie, Talking Head. They're not punk. No, that was punk. CB. No, that's not punk music. That's, and I'm, you can imagine how the rest of it went. I think the police were called eventually. But James is absolutely right. It was a strange time when this spark was lit, and then there was this coming together of, I don't know which part of...
Even the English bands, I don't think, set out to say, whoa, we're going to create this punk rock movement,
Right.
It wasn't like
It's
that.
just, it's I guess what, again, reaching to Jung would call a psychic epidemic. In Britain, that kind of thing is a lot more contagious, and a lot more bands can get swept up a lot quicker, and a lot of them ended up doing the same thing. And I guess we expected that, if you're a little brighter and you move on, you expect that to kind of peter out after a while. But it's still here. I mean, it's, as I said, the Strokes have just put out another album. You expected literally punk just to die off and be a quaint little corner of the artistic world, like German expressionism or something.
No, when you see, punk does articulate something that people do yearn for. Some people, maybe not you, but some people do yearn for it. Because I was, having to think about all this stuff because of articles I've been writing, and I was teaching this punk course at NYU, and there's so much commodified punk, right?
It's a uniform. I mean, when you're a punk, you're like a soldier in the punk army.
But I realised that even when people are like in a West Village boutique buying something that's like dripping in Swarovski crystals and ripped and torn and diamante safety pins, they're actually aspiring to some sort of libertarian, pagan, free ideals.
But the unfortunate thing is, Vivien, that the formal appearance of punk rock, quote unquote, as Green Day or all these bands would understand it. It's well, we come back to cultural fascism because I hate the fucking young. Because if you told me, if you'd come to me when I was even 14 and shown me Sha Na Na and told me that was like Eddie Cochran, I'd have told you to fuck right off. Whereas there are people now, and even people growing up who have jobs and cell phones, who think this shit passes the modern day shit. Is not an affront to all the shit from our time.
Well,
and it is an affront. It's obscene.
I was just telling you.
I think it's a lot harder to be young now than it was in our day.
That's true.
Young people are under a lot more economic pressure than we were. I mean, what our scene could not happen now. You couldn't have all these people coming to New York and living for almost nothing. I mean, none of us even had jobs.
Yeah. But I was just telling Stephen earlier this story that I did actually tell the class. It was about Green Day, what passes for punk now. Because I was watching the telly and I saw one of the blokes from Green Day saying, really seriously, as if completely unaware of the irony of billing himself as a punk and then having this dribble from his mouth. He said, well, now that we have, now that we've got our success, we finally felt free to say what we really think. So I said to the class, the punk class, do you think this is punk? And they're like, forget it.
I mean, it never would have occurred to any of us not to say what we really thought. From the beginning. That's what it was. There was no other alternative. I mean, we just didn't think in those terms of like, oh, we're gonna create something for the market. It just wasn't. It was irrelevant to us.
To be fair to punk bands today, they're not all like Green Day. I'm sure there's a lot of like hardcore bands or whatever that are very passionate about what they do and angry, and it means something. But I suppose the definition of post-punk that I would go with is one where it was inspired by punk, but it expressly was not about just reiterating the first Clash album or the first Black Flag album or whatever over and over again. It was more like defining punk as more
It's an idea.
a spiritual quest for reinvention and keep moving all the time.
And there were plenty of people who embodied that and kept on moving as far as the talent would take them.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, there were a lot of people who,
I think punk rock as such has become almost like the blues or something. It's like a form, and it kind of people keep discovering it. And it does do something useful and meaningful for the people who fall into it. And so when I mean, it's weird to me when I see like 15-year-old kids around Tompkins Square Park, and they have like the T-shirts of bands like The Exploited or GBH or Discharge, bands that I remember my younger brother wearing, and in 1981 or whatever. GBH, it's just, and but it sort of has developed this kind of folk life that carries on. You still see kids going to hardcore matinees and stuff. So, you know...
But Simon, it's like, I've just realised that what the comparison that springs to mind is these fucking idiot backpackers in Europe who have, you know, from France or whatever, who wander around with like the Doors and Hendrix, and they always will. They'll always be there. There'll always be punk rock. There'll always be these dumb kids who visit Jim Morrison's grave and have the Doors and Hendrix on their backpack and fly. It's like virus you just can't get rid of.
I want to ask about like the role of Malcolm McLaren, because in Legs' book he really gives a lot of like sort of credit to Malcolm McLaren, you know, coming to New York and then going back to London and sort of bringing style that he saw here first, and you know, sort of opening the shop.
Well, McLaren's an interesting. Vivien would be able to speak much more firsthand than this, but I happened to meet him a few times in recent years. It's just a funny little end to that story, because you're right. He was the ultimate conceptualist, very bright, doesn't see anything in the way of making a record. He'll find whoever he has to find to make it. He'll do whatever, present it in whatever form he has to. There's no nothing organic there, which is fine in its own way, right? And he's made some good records. Unfortunately, by insisting that you could get up and play and be in a band if you couldn't play, he unleashed a whole lot of shit on the world. And the funny thing is, I don't know what he was making trying to make an album recently, and I was talking to his lady friend who said, yeah, Malcolm, I don't know what the concept of the album is this time, whatever, but he's like, Malcolm's just going nuts. He says he can't find any decent musicians under 40. And you're thinking, yeah, that's your fucking fault, buddy.
Well, when I wrote the book, there's a whole chapter on Malcolm McLaren. He comes out of it pretty bad. He comes across as a kind of really exploitative monster. But the fact is, I was actually a really big fan of McLaren, and the two people I followed out of the Sex Pistols were John Lydon, as the exemplary post-punk person who made this amazing switch from, you know, being the front man of the most important band in the world to doing this total art trip thing, and then McLaren, I actually followed his every move because he gave such great interviews, and you know, Bow Wow, a pretty cool band, and
I like fans and some of his other records, oddly, even though
well, I draw the line there. But
So
you know, he was very entertaining figure to have around, and he did have all these concepts, but he, in a certain way, he was a kind of a post-punk figure, although he actually despised post-punk as we know it. He hated Pearl, and he hated Joy Division. He found he said it was like dreary, sexless music for students, you know, moping around and stuff. And he was like, his idea was, his founding experiences were based on rock and roll, and he thought everything should have that sort of impact of style, sex, and subversion, I think was his slogan. But unfortunately, he tried to be the front man of his own band, which was, I don't know, that didn't quite work with
It's not quite Little Richard, is it?
It's not quite stylish enough.
Vivien, you must have known him, so what was he like back then?
I did know him. I didn't know him that well. I was more friendly with John, and I have to say, John really loathed him because, I mean, he was, you know, well, he was very cynical. You know, he felt he could just completely mould the creativity of these young men and basically turn them into puppets for whatever far-reaching project he might project. I don't think he was like terribly like nice.
Well, and also Lydon was, and I guess this is taps into the post-punk sort of ethos. Was, I get the impression, I've only met him once, and certainly read hundreds of interviews. He seemed like an extremely sensitive motherfucker.
And very bright.
And because when he did, Simon writes in the book about how he went on, he broke from McLaren and went on the London radio station Capital, sorry for swearing so much, but went on Capital Radio and played his own playlists without asking McLaren's permission. And it was Tim Buckley and Dr. Alimentato and Can, and there was not one shred of punk rock there. And the way he answered the questions from a very sincere interviewer was extreme. I mean, I heard it recently, last year, and it's extremely touching. He's talking about, look, I'm getting beaten up now. And he's playing.
He was. I really remember. Used to be such a regular occurrence. It was. I was down the pub the other night, and they got me in the car park again. Can I not leave? It was hard. It was very hard.
people talk about how wonderful punk was. What about all that spitting?
Yeah. Well, I was.
People, New York bands went over there, they would just get covered in spit. I mean, they absolutely hated it.
Yeah.
Can I just say, we didn't.
You assaulted a guy.
We didn't do that in Glasgow.
You punched the guy out. Come on.
Can someone
Yeah, but people didn't. Yeah, but I didn't spit on people.
Can someone talk about perhaps the difference between the American viewpoint, which was we're going to make this goddamn racket. Somewhat different as far as what the end goal really was.
I don't think you can. I don't think you can generalize about either scene. You know?
Well, I don't really choose to, but
Everybody's got their own vision. I mean, everybody's.
I think in Britain maybe they're a bit more ambitious and a bit more in the not monetary sense, but the sense of success.
In England,
Just
they
'cause
were
it's-
more
it's-
hooked. They were more hooked into the kind of star-making machinery of
But it's,
the record companies.
it's within
than we
reach.
were.
It's much easier to become to get a record in the top 20 in Britain, and it was much easier to sort of conquer the press. You could get
Walking off the
a
street,
front cover
really.
story and not even have a single out in the
Yeah, in
case
America
of
you
a pop
wouldn't
group.
even.
I mean,
dream of
literally,
such
people
things.
were walking off the street. Elvis Costello used to come in off the street with those badges from Stiff, you know.
And what-
Elvis
once
is
you-
king.
and once you've seen that, you've seen bands who have a good line of patter and a good kind of line in salesmanship. It becomes part of the way of doing things. I mean, there are, you know, it reached an extreme with this band by the 90s called the Manic Street Preachers, where you had the music guys with the drummer and the singer, and there was another guy whose instrument wasn't even turned on when they were on stage, who was basically just to kind of, his job was to
Right.
give interviews. He was like the rhetoric, and he wrote the lyrics, and he kind of, so, but there's often in British bands there is someone like that.
Not alive.
Sorry?
Are we ever going to start believing that he is dead?
Richie?
Yeah, Richie. He's dead. Like,
Yeah, I think so. But,
Go back, Simon. Sorry, I didn't interrupt you.
yeah, I mean, I think that there's always been a bit more of it's more within reach. I mean, I think in America maybe the gap between doing something experimental and making it pay is so huge that you might as well just have the total purity. Whereas in Britain, there is actually a kind of, it's worth thinking about the trade-off.
Yeah, I
But
mean,
it's,
you
but it all
know,
comes
in
back to it all
England,
comes back to the thing of geography as destiny.
Right.
Not to harp on and on and on about this, but when you've got an island of 25 million people that's smaller than Texas, whatever, strange things happen.
It's 56, I think, isn't it?
Oh no, you're right. You're right. So, my bad.
Twice as many.
But even more to the point. Yeah.
But
So,
me-
when you have that kind of concentration, there's less. I don't know. It's less stratified. Like if a band was playing in CBGB's, I mean, I know Clive Davis came down and discovered Patti Smith and all the rest of it, but for most bands, I'd have thought it would have been difficult to imagine going up to Midtown and getting an appointment. Whereas
Absolutely.
No, I was just going to say that in England, it has a really different place in the culture of music, doesn't it? It's like football or something. Everybody's into it, and loads of people are into bands. More than
people are all
here.
into music.
But I mean, across the whole country, and as you say, it's smaller.
Everywhere, isn't it? I mean, you could find a decent band in almost every bar. You could
But the American mainstream is so far removed from what was happening here in New York or in LA. You know, it's a two different worlds completely.
I think also in Britain, there's maybe slightly more of this thing of I mean, you had people like this in America, like Michael Zilka with Z Records, or certain people in major labels, but in Britain there's a lot more of this kind of what I think of as being of kind of aesthete entrepreneurs, like people who are kind of shrewd business people, but also aesthetics driven as well. And sometimes they would start a label, like Jeff Travis with Rough Trade, or Tony Wilson with Factory. Sometimes they would actually be working in a major label, almost kind of running it with an independent head kind of thing, and sort of a music first head. So maybe that sort of allowed, I mean, when I grew up, we would see every so often you'd see Public Image Limited on the television, or Joy Division on TV, or these things that would never really have happened except for the time when Pearl were on American Bandstand. quite a remarkable thing to see. But I mean, you would mostly, James, you'd probably been like on Glenn O'Brien's cable show, right? But there wouldn't be much chance of you being on
No, I've never
national
been on a
TV.
major label in my life.
You wouldn't like to get much sort of mass media.
No, not at all. No, I would have liked to.
Well, James Walcott, the Vanity Fair critic who at the time was working for the Village Voice, was one of the first people to write about this nascent punk rock thing, I think in '75, and Simon quotes the article in the, I think it was called The Conservative Impulse of the New Rock Underground, whatever, '75. Anyway, the little soundbite was public access rock. And that's, in American terms, that's what it was, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was in that, it had its own little area.
File under marginal.
Exactly. So, and for whatever reason, geographic, cultural things in Britain can rise up a lot quicker.
But also a lot of rubbish can get high.
Oh yes.
But I mean,
that's the second hour of
we
our
have
talk.
we have a weird thing that's in Britain, the novelty single, which is usually something that's incredibly, possibly kitsch or embarrassing, but occasionally it will be something like Laurie Anderson's "Oh Superman" got to #2 in the charts in Britain. So
Did it chart here, that record?
I don't think so.
No.
Does anybody remember?
So
I haven't.
No.
Wasn't a huge hit over here.
and also like public radio in Britain is or certainly was then, was the only way to hear pop music really, and so there was a kind of, you had someone like John Peel who would play a lot of weird music at a time of day when you could hear it, and it kind of built up an audience, and then sometimes other people on the Radio 1, the big national station, would pick up something that he was championing and kind of play it, and it would become a hit. So
That was the good side of socialism.
They try to do that here with like KCRW in that Morning Becomes a Lecturer, but they don't allow it really to filter into the system in the same way. You say fair. Does someone say fair?
Yeah, fair.
Bah.
Well, NPR has a kind of genteel character. It's a little, it's not quite as vibrant as
John Peel.
yeah.
I can't listen to it. I can't make it work.
You would do the singles reviews every few weeks that would like rotating papers.
How on earth did you see them?
What?
How on earth?
No, I used to
Did you
buy
live in
them.
England?
No, I used to buy them in New York. They come out on a Friday. And I know, like, how did you find out about this?
Well, me personally, there would always be this big stack, obviously, that people send in trying to get covered, be it Elvis Costello bringing his first single or whomever. But I used to go out and find singles because I used to like to write about reggae, and I used to go and stand in the reggae shops, like, for hours with other fans, and you'd listen to the music and you sound like that one. Buy it, take it home and write about it. So I guess I did A&R, a lot of that stuff.
You went out and found it yourself.
Well, yeah, but in those days they had these quaint things called record shops. I mean, there's one now very near here, Jammyland, but I don't know how long it'll be there because I think they're going to put their rent up, and so like everything else is being driven out of the Lower East Side. Everything that is not sort of big box.
So how would that work? Like, one week you would do it, and then you rotate?
Yeah, there would be a rota, but not on the reggae stuff, but in general I would sometimes be put on duty to do all, that was just the way it worked on paper.
yeah.
Is that probably works similar to that now, Yeah, but I mean,
I don't think it exists anymore, does it?
no, singles, no, not sound, but I mean, they taped articles around the staff. Yeah.
Well, we actually have to wrap up now because we're going to put, we're going to get ready for another set of performers.
Ooh.
So, but if anyone wants to buttonhole members of the panel, we'll be in the bar downstairs, and you can also find copies of my book there if you wish to take them home with you.
Highly recommend
Which is a very fantastic book. Well done.
Thank you very much to the panel for coming.